why? And second, do you, for example, have a responsibility to strike a balance? Where they support Mr. Scargill, welcome to Talking to Myself. My guest this evening is a controversial figure, a man described as the devil incarnate, the most dangerous man in Britain, and certainly the most controversial trade union leader in modern times. I'm speaking of Arthur Scargill, President of the National Union of Mine Workers. Arthur, tell me, why do you constantly criticize television, radio, and the media generally for your image, when you've had the opportunity to appear on television more often than the test card? The answer is very simple. The demonology surrounding Arthur Scargill has been artificially created by the media, which in turn has been directed by Margaret Thatcher and the Tory governments, and I suspect by her predecessors as well. The fact is that each interview that I do is preceded by the interviewer saying, Mr. Scargill, why do you, for example, want to call a strike? Or why do you hold the country to ransom? And the question presupposes that I'm doing something wrong without ever asking the question about the opposition and about, say, the National Coal Board in our case, or British Steel, or the Railways Board. But it's you who refuse to answer questions. It's you who call for strikes in the mining industry.
That's not true.
It's you who call for chaos inside our society.
Absolute rubbish.
Surely you accept that you're responsible for your own image. On the contrary, I reject totally that accusation. The fact is that I was prepared to go along with the plan for coal in the mining industry, which was signed by the Labour government of 1974, the National Coal Board and the NUM. Here was an agreement that was publicly accepted and even endorsed by Mrs. Thatcher. And yet, when the Conservative government broke that agreement, interviewers on television didn't say, Mr. Scargill, why do you think people should condemn the Coal Board for breaking an agreement, or condemn the Tory government for breaking an agreement? The question they posed inevitably was, why do you threaten industrial action? When the answer was obvious. It was because the Tory government had broken their promise, not merely to the NUM or Arthur Scargill, but to the electorate. Don't you accept that we in television have a responsibility to strike a balance? Can't you accept that it's impossible to put your view without putting that of the opposition? I think you've got an obligation to present a fair and balanced picture, but unfortunately you don't do it. Let me give you two examples. First of all, contrast what happens in reporting from Afghanistan, Poland, and China, where the BBC and ITV defy martial law and reported the events from those places onto Britain's television screens.
But Mr. Scargill.
Now let me finish. And secondly, also contrast the attitude of the media, where they support the strikes of solidarity in Poland and the miners in the Soviet Union, and quite rightly so, who've taken strike action without a ballot, with their treatment of the National Union of Mine Workers or other workers in Britain who have taken strike action possibly without a ballot, but in accordance with their rule book. Now that's not fair or balanced reporting. It's certainly not objective television, and you know it. Why can't you accept that we've got to make editorial judgments, that we're only doing our job? Surely you recognize we've got to strike a balance. What's important to you may not be important to me or important to the viewers. I can accept that it's not the answer that you want, and that's precisely why you pose the question in the way that you do. It's because of that that we get the sanitized version of events both inside and outside this nation. The fact that we get the reporting of Sinn Féin banned in Britain. The fact that we do not get fair reporting of industrial disputes, and we only apparently get one side of the argument presented. It's the very opposite of the point that you're making. Each time we have an industrial dispute, statements put out by the corporation, for example, on British Rail or by British Coal, are accepted by the media as authoritative versions, and statements put out by the trade unions are quoted as astonishing or remarkable assertions on the part of those particular organizations. That's not fair reporting. That is editorial judgment that carries bias and distortion. Why did you refuse your members the right to have an individual ballot vote in the 1984 miners' strike?
Mr. Scargill, that's typical distortion.
In spite of repeated requests from interviewers, you refuse to condemn violence on the picket lines. Why? Both those questions are typical distortion. The fact is that we offered our membership in an annual conference on 3 occasions the opportunity to have an individual ballot vote. And by democratic decision, the membership decided not to have an individual ballot vote, but with 80% of miners already on strike, call upon the rest of the miners to take supportive action and not to cross picket lines. As far as violence is concerned, I've continuously condemned police violence on picket lines and condemned the unlawful activities of the police in stopping ordinary citizens travelling up and down our motorways, something that Mrs. Thatcher has patently refused to do. Now, why is it, Mr. Scargill, that you don't put the same question about violence to Mrs. Thatcher? Why don't you ask her why she refuses to condemn her police force for their violence against pickets, which resulted in 7,000 being injured and 11 people dying? Why do you take an antagonistic attitude each time I put a perfectly proper question to you, either about violence on picket lines or an individual ballot vote in the 1984 miners' strike? My attitude is not antagonistic. My attitude is, I suppose, one of frustration. I've answered those questions time and time again. The problem is that both at BBC and ITV, you've edited out the truth. And there's one famous example where the British Broadcasting Corporation at Orgreave actually turned the sequence of events around so that it demonstrated that the police were the subject of a picket's charge when the reverse was the case. And it was only the riot charges that were brought against several of our members that proved in the High Court that the BBC had done this. And in the event, not only were our members found not guilty, but the BBC was found guilty of distorting the events. Accepting that point, could I turn now, Mr. Scargill, to the miners' strike itself? Many of your opponents, and certainly most commentators, would argue very powerfully that you were responsible for snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. Why couldn't you negotiate a sensible solution to the dispute with the National Coal Board? Well, there are 2 points. First of all, I certainly did not snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. What I didn't do was to sell out my members and sign an agreement which would have resulted in the union's acquiescence to the closure of pits and the loss of jobs in this industry. And secondly, we certainly did attempt to settle the miners' strike. And on at least 5 occasions, we reached an agreement, at least in principle with the National Coal Board, to settle the strike. Unfortunately, the dead hand of Mrs. Thatcher and Number 10 stopped the settlement of the dispute. The question you ought to be posing, Mr. Scargill, is to Mrs. Thatcher. Why did she refuse to settle the miners' strike, and in doing so cost Britain's taxpayers £12 billion? Arthur, you are, of course, a public figure. Why do you object to questions about your private life? I think it's a damned intrusion for anybody to start talking about anybody's personal life, unless, of course, it impinges upon their professional duties. And until and unless a person's professional duties impinge in any way into their personal life, I think that the media should keep its nose out. You're in a privileged position. Act with the responsibility. Arthur, we've reached the end of our time. And even though, once again, you've avoided answering direct questions, I'm sure the viewing public will have formed their own judgment. Could I take this opportunity of thanking you for talking to me on this very special program? And also, of course, thanking myself for interviewing you. With our minds as the opposition, for example, with their treatment of the national responsibility. Mr. Scargill, as why you can't accept why secondly you accept without all that Mr. Scargill, why?